Visual memory techniques are incredibly easy to master to make learning and remembering anything, almost anything, for the long term so fun. It's unbelievable. But there's a counterintuitive element to visual memory techniques. And once you understand what that is, you'll be able to be so much more successful in applying visual memory techniques to whatever it is that you feel called to learn, to pass exams, learn languages, or build a better experience as an expert in your field so you can get a raise or whatever it is that you're looking for out of visual memory techniques. So what are they? Well, we think we all sort of understand what visual is. It's the idea of seeing something in the world, being able to picture it in the mind in perhaps a variety of ways, or one way, visually. But that's part of the counterintuitive hook here. However, if we look at our ancestors and what we basically know about them or can speculate about, we have used visual memory techniques in the most directly visual way for a very long time. So let me speculate a little bit and talk about Stonehenge. There's some reason to believe that Stonehenge was a visual memory technique to help remember something about the seasons, and there may even have been ways that people looked into patterns in the stones that helped them remember things that they would teach others when they were having gatherings in that area where Stonehenge was built. Now, if you want to go down the rabbit hole of those speculations and what may or may not be true about that, definitely read The Memory Code by Lynn Kelly. There's other ways to think about this visual aspect of externalized visual memory techniques. If we think about our hands, for example. So hands were very popular memory techniques for quite a long time. And we know this from something called the Guidonian hand, where notes of the scale were mentally mapped onto the fingers, and so you would, in a spiral pattern, move through the positions of the hands, and people would literally stand in front of the choir and point to parts of the hand to help the choir remember the notes that needed to be sung in a particular piece. So that's a visualization that is externalized. Now, as humans begin to build alphabets and create written language and share codes through books, scrolls, etc., what ends up happening is we begin to have symbolic logic, and we are able to internalize both the sounds and the shapes of our letters. So let's say, as some people say, the alphabet starts with A, and A is based on the upside down head of an ox. Well, the A is not just associated with a visual image in the world, but it becomes a symbol that we now think about in our minds, and we can reproduce so that we can see it produced by our own hands and link it to the sound A or ah, or many other variations. It's no longer external or internal, it's both. And this is a very, very important thing to understand about visual memory techniques. Because let's say A is an ox's head, it represents an animal. Well, it's also the first letter in a sequence. So A becomes linked with 1, and B becomes 2, C becomes 3, etc., in the way that Z becomes 26, Y becomes 25, X becomes 24, and so on and so on. And this is part of how visual memory techniques work, or can work, depending on how you want to develop your own personal mnemonic systems, because this is ultimately what every person has to do. So if you were going to use your environment to help remember what it is you wanted to talk about, you might do something like Hugh of St. Victor did, where he talked about using Noah's Ark as a memory palace, and scholars think that he literally had a diagram of the memory palace of Noah's Ark behind him, and then he would help his students memorize in real time, or at least that's a possible thing that he did, by referring to how he used Noah's Ark as a memory palace and saying, here is the name of Noah's first son and the year that I think he was born. By the way, that year has a number, that number has a symbol. Use that number, letter, symbol construct to help you remember that information. I've talked about this at some length in my video on the imaginary memory palace of Hugh of St. Victor, so you can go deep into that. But the point that you want to understand is that it's personalized by the person using the memory techniques, but it's also shared because our internal, external visual memory techniques are based on alphabet, number, and object in the world. And you don't necessarily have to see it in your mind, but you will want to be able to reproduce it by being able to write out what it is that you have memorized. And we know that writing is one of the ultimate memory techniques. To go back to Lynn Kelly, who wrote the memory code, she has written on the La Trobe University blog that it is really the ultimate encryption technique if you really want to get long-term memory going. And it is a visual memory technique, because what else would writing be except the visualization of an internal and external symbol system based on numbers, letters, symbols. And those symbols are phonic. They're related to sound in almost every case. Now, there are some exceptions to the rule. For example, when I was invited to be the commentator on the 2023 Pan American Open Memory Championship, they had a surprise round where they asked the competitors to memorize clouds. And Johannes Mallow asked me, Anthony, would you speculate on what technique they would use to memorize cloud formations, since it's very abstract? And I said, they're probably using a 00 to 99 PAO, which is person, action, object, literally having an image for every two-digit pair from 00 to 99. And it turns out that my speculation about that was correct, because how else would you do it? So that's why I say almost anything can be memorized with these symbols. You just have to have visual memory techniques prepared in advance, personalized, and based on these symbols. Now, writing is one of the most important things, and one of my most recent memory notebooks here, or memory journals, I call them memory journals, maybe it's a Canadian thing, cahier from French, I think, if memory serves, and I just write out what I've memorized. So I use association symbols, and one of my latest projects is, and my pronunciation here is not great, I work on pronunciation later someday. I really haven't quite figured out the best mnemonic strategy for pronunciation. And we can all have our weaknesses, it's okay, but I haven't really quite cracked the pronunciation code, although sometimes I get closer than other times. But the tones for what I'm memorizing right now are 4, 2, 1, which would be Dao, De, Jing, right? Jing, probably better, Jing. Anyway, just often we just pronounce it Dao De Jing, right? And it is the Lao Tzu text who wrote about topics that interest me, which is how to control your mind and not, get blown away when the world of contradictions doesn't make sense. So what I've done is just basically memorized using visual memory techniques, and they are at the letter of the alphabet and number. And so the memory palace is numbered, and I start to memorize what it is. So Dao Ke Dao, Fei Chong Dao, Ming Ke Ming, Fei Chong Ming. Relatively simple. But then when I get to the next part, it gets a little more challenging, and I have to think about how I'm going to memorize these things, and I have to have a place, a memory palace. Maybe you don't, but I do, and most of us do, and that place now needs to be linked with the visual image of what's going to be there. And it's a wonderful thing to work on and to be able to have these images. But I said there's something counterintuitive to it. Visual memory techniques, as I use them, are not really visual at the end of the day until logic lands first. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. But if you would like support and inspiration and accountability along your own journey with these techniques, my Magnetic Memory Method Inner Circle will be opening soon for new members. And the way to get that is to start with my free course at magneticmemorymethod.com/YT. Many, many thousands of people have gone through this. I've seen many, many thousand memory palace drawings from people over the years, and they get success when they take action. And I only invite people to the inner circle who at least share the common dialogue that I teach through that course. And if you would be interested in joining us, get that course at magneticmemorymethod.com/YT and join the journey, because part of what's in there is working on visualization so that you can see images better in your mind or experience them in a multisensory way. I remember a guy, Paul Pfister, if memory serves, he said that in my training, the visualization mastery course was one of the best things for him. So start with the free class, learn how to use memory palaces in the way that I teach. And you don't have to use them the way that I teach, but it will help you set a foundation and it is a visual memory technique, especially when you do it the way that I teach. Because even if you have aphantasia or you can't see images in your mind, I don't see images in my mind very well, but I see them well enough, or I'm able to use the visual element well enough, because there's more than the visual when it comes to memory techniques. I'm able to use it well enough because of how that I teach in that course. And even people who are already visual, like Paul told me, he was already super visual, he got a lot out of it because he thought about it in a different way. Okay, so the ultimate thing to understand about visual memory techniques is that to get faster and to have longer recall of whatever it is that you want to memorize, you have to approach it at the level of logic. And this is the level of using visual memory techniques where everything for you will start to improve and change if you aren't already doing this already. So what do I mean by logic? Well, it's the conceptual visualization mode. And if we take something like what I'm memorizing now in my little special memory journal here, forgiving the pronunciation, which I haven't quite mastered yet, it's something like Wu Ming Qian Di Zhi Shi. Zhi Shi, maybe? My wife's here listening. But I have a hard time pleasing her standard of pronunciation, and I just have to memorize the words. But that's the second part of at least how I'm approaching memorizing this. And I had to write it down. And, you know, if I look and see Wu Ming Qian Di Zhi Shi, so I basically pronounced that right. And basically, rather than go for the visual mode first, I go for the logical mode first. So what is Wu going to be? Well, usually when I have Wu, which comes up in Mandarin quite a bit, or Chinese quite a bit, the Wu-Tang clan, right? Ming, lemon meringue pie. Now, that Ming and meringue is not exactly the same thing. Tian Di. Well, this is the beautiful thing about using these techniques is, you know Tian is sky, etc. And sky, right? Yeah, so, it starts to compound. And D can be related to things like place, etc. So, but I still need the logic, but the logic compounds over time. It gets faster and faster because you know what these words mean in different contexts. But I still go through the basic ropes, the logic, right? So Tian to me is like a teacup with yen. That's a logical association. D is like Dee Snider from Twisted Sister. And then on and on and on. I approach it logically first. What's the logical association? And then I visualize. And when you get into a pattern like this for yourself, it may not be this pattern for you, but if you focus on developing one for yourself, and then it gets very fast to create the associations. So visual memory techniques do not have to start visually. And for many of us, we're going to get faster and longer gains if we can use the muscle development world to draw upon for inspiration. We're going to get gains a lot faster and with greater lasting power if we start logically. And that's the counterintuitive nature of visual memory techniques. Aristotle talked about this thousands of years ago. It was part of releasing memory techniques from needing to always refer strictly to objects in the world, like the hand. He noticed that you could place images logically in the memory palace, alphabetically, and then have them float around in different sequences, and this is amazing. So, if you want to stick around here on YouTube, please, of course, join me for the free course at magneticmemorymethod.com/YT, but also consider checking out my video on Aristotle's releasing of visual memory techniques into more of the conceptual based on the alphabet in my video, Aristotle's Nuclear Alphabet. Go ahead, check that out next.